All right. Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to The Right Side Up with Danielle Strickland and the absolutely silent today, James Scholl, who's not able to be here. And I actually was saying to my amazing guest, Bette Dickenson, earlier, that he probably just was like, I'm not sure I'd get a word in edgewise anyway between these two. But we
Probably
miss you,
not.
James. Little shout out.
Miss you, James.
Yeah, and Bette Dickenson is here, and she's been on before. Betty's a good friend. She's part of the Boundless community, if you've heard of that at all. And she's just launched this beautiful book, but also cohort and spiritual formation tool called The Art of Vinemaking. And I was able to be at the first launch of the in-person in the vineyard at a retreat center in Traverse City, Michigan, just a couple weeks ago. Feels like a year ago, because I
Yes.
feel like so much has happened. And then also feels like yesterday of this beautiful time together where we really did a deep dive and began this journey of spiritual flourishing in a productivity-driven culture. And I guess we just want to talk about it, Bette. Partly we're in this series on the powers and principalities. And so what on earth does vine making have to do with, overthrowing the powers? Everything. Tell us all the things, Bette. Tell me how you're feeling after this launch. It's a big thing to launch a beautiful and also very comprehensive work. So if people don't know the book, The Art of Vinemaking, it's got like the full seasons, like the full flourishing overview of how this whole thing works in every season. So this is a worthy, this is a worthy exploration of a long, beautiful vision of flourishing. Tell me how you're feeling, Bette.
Yeah. Well, I'm feeling great. I think especially now that, as you mentioned, the retreat that we were at a couple weeks ago, it's one thing to, I've been on this journey for about 6 years, learning from my vine dresser or vine farmer friend, Dave Boss, and just doing this research behind the scenes, getting into vineyards. And every time I would have these interactions with Dave, my mind would just oh my goodness, so many more people need to know this about what often we miss in, we're not in an agrarian culture here, at least we aren't here in the West where I live. And yet Dave had all these connections that were being made for me between a farming way of life, a flourishing way of life, the organic view of farming, and how do we flourish spiritually. And so when I put all of this together and had in mind, I want to bring people with me into the vineyard, both through the book, but also these encounters in the vineyard themselves, to actually get people in the vineyard there the last couple of weeks and to see the aha moments happen for them and happen for you and happen for so many that were like, oh, I had no idea that this is the way to live, and that this is how a real vine dresser who loves his vines looks at vines. And so it's just been exciting, and it feels like a harvest moment for me. So many moments of that retreat especially felt like the full ripening of so many things going on in my own story, but also getting to finally share the harvest with real, actual people brought so much joy. So,
Yeah. I mean, and it's all the things I feel like you and I have been part of a community, Infinitum, which is kind of a spiritual formation. It's a rule of life for people who don't like rules. That's how I describe it sometimes. So we call it a way. And I was really like just being there. And, one of the things we've been itching at is that we've made spiritual formation or theology or discipleship into an intellectual exercise of just like a belief system. So if you just learn more stuff and believe good stuff, everything will be fine. And then we're like, no, that's not quite how it works. We're an integrated people, we're whole body, soul, spirit. So we've and me personally, I've just been experimenting with like, what does it mean to have an encounter? What does it mean to actually have an encounter with God? That's where all the transformation is, where it goes from your head to your heart, What does it mean to have a genuine encounter with other people where it's like mutuality exists and reciprocity? We're seeing each other through sacred lenses, but then also receiving something beautiful. What does it mean to be like in the land, and I've been wildly experimenting with things from grounding to cold plunging to breath work to, And so I felt like this cohort, this retreat, this encounter you offered was kind of all of these things, this deep, rich theology with this like curious, compassionate, like, tell me more right? About like this expert who does this organic. And then it was like, lad, like this is land. We're supposed to know about this. Like we're supposed to be connected to this ecosystem of thriving. And it was like also this, and we are supposed to do it together. So
Mm,
I felt like there were all these, again, I kind of felt it with you, this like a
mm,
harvesting, a ripening of what we've been like, we're
mm,
missing some things like.
mhm.
So that was
Well,
really beautiful.
yeah, well, and I think, as we think about the dethroning the powers, I think one of the powers that we're up against right now is a power that disconnects us from our bodies and land and maybe tries to keep us in our brains and intellect. And I think what the retreat did for a lot of us was, I think, one, when I was debriefing with our friend Liz, she had said it just felt like the time was ripe, like the grape that's easily picked from the cluster. And as I sort of processed that a little bit of what is the time ripe for right now, I think one of the things that came up for me was the time is ripe for these embodied encounters, because as you said, we've been primarily discipling people from the left side of the brain, which is words, analytical thinking, scripture study, theology, belief systems, which are all important. But what's fascinating about neuroscience research over the last 15 years is that they've discovered we're not actually formed by those things. They're important, but our brains process information from the right side of the brain to the left. And the right side are these embodied experiences that we have with all five senses. It's our relational connections and our attachments with relationships, both with God and other people. And it's our imagination. And so our character is formed out of those experiences. And then it's the left side of the brain that helps us make sense of what we just sensed, as Dr. Kurt Thompson says. And I think for a lot of us, it was a ripe moment to have an embodied encounter with creation itself, like you said, with the land, but also with these metaphors that Jesus, when he spoke these things, he was likely standing in a vineyard saying, I am the true vine and my father is the vine dresser. And his audience would have deeply understood. And so I think the time is ripe in making those connections, not just through words, but actual experience. And just was so beautiful to hear how many people were like, I just had this profound embodied encounter with God in the vineyard, and just felt his presence through the sun and feeling the leaves and tasting the grapes and talking with Dave, the vine dresser, and just beholding and seeing a new vision for what flourishing could be.
You open the book, I wrote the foreword to this book pretty much because listening to you and Dave talk on a prayer day, so we do these monthly prayer days. By the way, little ad, if you want to join us on a monthly prayer day, it's every second Wednesday of the month through infinitum. And Bette leads us in a guided prayer practice. And there's a PDF guide of ways you could pray that would be more embodied and potentially different and new. And then we pray with one another. So it is an actually way of connecting, even through the Zoomy places,
Hmm.
even through the internet, genuine connection. But when you had Dave on as a guest and you were actually comparing sort of the industrialized farming to the organic farming, because it's one of Dave's specialties, right? Where
Hmm.
or
Hmm.
maybe even like rage areas where he's like, why are we doing this to the land? Which is good. So he's like all 10 steps in. I'm just sort of like, what? They grow these? Like, I remember the first time someone's like, where do you think that comes from? I'm like, the supermarket? I don't know. I'm like city girl. So I was at a farm. I remember being at this like farmstead with some friends I met, and they were like, we were having, I think it was actually like Thanksgiving or something. They served up the turkey and the kids started calling it by name. I was like, what is that? I cannot eat a thing with a name. And then the kids are like, well, where do you think like, where do you think meat comes from? And I'm like, I don't know, but it's not that name. Anyway, so I've had like a long journey into connection too, right? Things
Mm.
you grow and things it's Wendell Berry, I think, that says you're not even alive unless your hands are in the dirt, right? You haven't
Hmm.
even touched life till you've connected. But you and Dave were talking about this like industrialized approach, which is all this productivity idea. And I mean, you actually productivity driven is the term that you're using to even describe what other people might use the word empire so again, when we're talking about dethroning the powers, we could even say it's a principality industrialization. And this principality works on this driven, controlled, maximum benefit to the person who wants it, even though that's not what happens in the end. But anyway, it's like a taking
Mhm.
right? So an industrialized farming approach is like, how much can we get out of this plot of land and how quickly can we get it and how much profit can we make? Those are sort of the key. And an organic, framework is like totally different. Like,
Mhm.
how can I connect to this place? How can I create a sustaining and be part of creating an ecosystem that brings flourishing? And that's like a
Mhm.
long-term approach. It's a sustainable approach. It's a connected approach. And as I was listening to you guys talk about this, it was like you said, like my mind and heart were just like lit up because, and this is interesting, I think from a distance I can go, well, of course that makes sense. But I don't think I'd ever applied it to the way I view a ministry before. So I was thinking about even just the way we do ministry when we look at a place and say, okay, what can we get out of this place? And this can even be like we can make measurable goals that sound good. So, like, how many converts can we get? How fast can we get them? Like, how can we advertise how fast we can get this? Like, even when we advertise, you should invest in this ministry because this is what we could produce. But actually, and when I look back over a lifetime, of doing this, I look back, and you do this really well in your book, sort of with this metanoia, this awakening of looking back, going, "Oh, gee, I wonder if that was
Mm.
actually beneficial to the place I was in. Like, I
Mhm.
wonder if these workers under me that I worked too hard for the sake of a product, instead of understanding the interconnectedness and the mutual flourishing that should be part of
Mhm.
our work. I wonder if those injuries, you know, are healable. I wonder, and I think even in our lives, where we drive ourselves and think that that's good.
Yeah,
Because that, I think, is where the principality's at work. We're
that's
taking
right.
this proper impulse, but then twisting it in this weird way.
Well, and it's a typical ends justify the means. So I think what I wrote about in the introduction as my first interaction with Dave in the vineyard was I had gone there to take some pictures of vines for a painting I was working on and a little devotional piece. And I was like, I don't know anything about vines. And I want to talk to an actual vine dresser because it was on John 15 about pruning. And I was like, I don't even know what this is. So I met with Dave in the vineyard and I asked him, well, what do vine dressers pay attention to when tending vines? And he said, and I'll never forget this because it was one of those total mind shift moments where he said, vine dressers actually don't pay much attention. Good vine dressers, organic vine dressers, don't pay much attention to the fruit. They pay attention to the health, the quality, and the vitality of the vine. And if you pay attention to those things, good quality fruit will be the natural overflow. And that for him, especially in vine dressing, it's not about quantity, it's about quality. And I think, in the ministry context that I had been working in, I myself was burning out under this mindset of more, more, more. Like more, you got to produce more, it's got to be more efficient. Where my performance was measured by, how many people were involved in the ministry, how many people came to Jesus, and we've all had these metrics, I think, that we measure ourselves. And it's not that measuring those things isn't necessarily bad, but it's when we put those things as the ultimate aim that
Hmm.
then we sort of neglect the whole process that of generating fruit. And also the fruit that Jesus talked about wasn't these external metrics. Jesus was talking about character change and who we're becoming. And so it just began to lead me on this whole journey, like you said, of seeing these two different mindsets play out in my own life and in our own culture. One is the productivity driven approach of empire, where it's capitalism, it's all the things that we're trying to, like you said, squeeze out of the land and squeeze out of people to be more efficient for the output, versus the flourishing approach that, as I learned from Dave, was incredibly relational. It's the interdependent relationship between not just the vine, but the soil and the microbes in the soil, the relationships between all these different cover crops and plants and animals on the whole ecosystem that are deeply interdependent and interconnected. It's the relationship that Dave has with the vines, where he said, a lot of industrial farms, for example, they'll put a schedule on when harvest time is and when to prune. And he said that may be system efficient, but that actually neglects the season the vine is in, the weather, what the vine is doing. And in order to tend a vine to be healthy and flourishing, it's highly relational. He said, I have to get into the vineyard 8 to 10 times during the growing season just to pay attention to what's going on and to respond to what's happening in the vine instead of creating a system that's the same for everything because it's more scalable and more efficient that way. Mm. I had, recently this profound moment so Robin Wall Kimmerer talks a lot about this too in her work. So the serviceberry, her newest work, and also braiding sweetgrass. And I listened to her recently when she came to Traverse City for a National Writer Series. And she had this moment where she was trying to express this flourishing approach too of sort of this gift economy of reciprocity, right? That we actually could live a flourishing way where we're giving and we're receiving from one another instead of just trying to make the biggest profit for ourselves. And somebody had asked her, how do you try to implement that kind of economy and that kind of flourishing approach in such a capitalistic society, in a society that is very productivity driven? And she had this beautiful picture where she said, if you think of an invasive species that let's just imagine this behemoth of a plant that's blocking out all the light. Invasive species often sort of suck up all the nutrients from the soil and they push other organisms out. So it becomes a monoculture. She said, you can't uproot that very well, but what you can do is invest in the understory, in the plant life on the forest floor, because the reality is that plant, that invasive species isn't sustainable. It's vulnerable to natural disturbance like wind and storms and ice and rain, and then it will fall one day.
Mm.
She said, rather than worrying so much about what's going on with that, trust that one day it will fall because it has a timeline. And when it does, then the understory has the chance to grow up. And I just think, gosh, is that not the moment that we're in right now, right? Where this giant invasive species, we're all like, what do we do with this like totalitarian, regime and capitalism and like all the things that are sucking up all the nutrients and trying to make this culture of productivity and where financial goals, are the highest aim or numbers are the highest aim and pushing others out, creating a monoculture rather than like striving of all of our effort to uproot that thing. Let's invest in a different way. And I think
Mhm.
that's my longing for the art of vinemaking and my longing for what the work we're doing with Infinitum, what you're doing, like, is to create an understory of flourishing where there's mutuality and reciprocity, where there's biodiversity in the ecosystem, where there is belonging and a sense of belovedness of all people, where everything can flourish so that when the time comes, and it will come, that's what grows and that's what flourishes.
I love that idea of like it's sort of like I have this phrase that's repeating in my mind right now that's like, I know something you don't know
Yeah.
to the powers,
Yeah.
sort of like, which is from The Princess Bride, everybody. Because there's no podcast episode if there isn't a Princess Bride quote. But that sort of like cheeky, I know something you don't know to these type, like I've
Mm,
been reading Daniel and Revelation as
mhm.
well at the same
Yeah.
time. And just sort of this idea that like, okay, yeah, you're gonna rage and you're gonna, tyrants are gonna be tyrant. That's why in Exodus they don't even bother naming the Pharaoh, because it's like a Pharaoh like every other Pharaoh. Like there's nothing new about this. This is just like
Right.
these are
Yep.
how pharaohs act, but I know something you don't know, right? And there's this like deeper, non-compliance. So like
Mm,
people who say like, nope, I'm not gonna comply with this. And then there's this like act of solidarity and, attending to the work. So one of the things I actually just struck me now actually is when I was studying Exodus, because I wrote a book years ago called The Ultimate Exodus. And I was looking sort of for the blueprint, because Exodus is kind of like the foundational story of salvation and deliverance. And I had been, spending decades of my life with women who've been sexually exploited and anti-trafficking efforts and things like that. So I was looking just at this blueprint of freedom. And one of the things I noticed when I really studied the book is that when the story of Exodus starts, it's been 300 years since the Israelites entered Egypt. And when the Israelites entered Egypt, they were shepherds. They've always been shepherds. That's part of the identity of Israel, which is why God calls himself the great shepherd or the good shepherd. And when you pick up the story in the oppression, they're now laying bricks. They're bricklayers. They're not shepherds anymore. And we don't know exactly what happened. We know that they still live in the best land for shepherding in Egypt still. They live in Goshen, which was given to them as an honorable gift. There's some people that say like the Pharaoh at the time just didn't like shepherds. It was a change of guard and they disregarded shepherds. So shepherds were, thought of as less than. But what we know is by the time we pick up the story, the Israelites are in full on oppression part of a system that is just everyone's oppressed in Egypt, not just the Israelites, everybody. It's like there is a system of oppression and they're all laying bricks. And I originally always thought of the Exodus story like a little bit like the Israelites were enslaved, like the transatlantic slavery, kind of thing where they'd been kidnapped and taken against their will and forced. But then a justice advocate friend of mine was like, read the story, Danielle. The only person that calls the Israelites slaves in Exodus is God. They have their own homes. They have their own livestock. They have a representative that speaks to the king. So he's like, what kind of slave is that exactly? Like, tell me a little bit. So they definitely are suffering the oppression of being
Mm.
caught in this system. And then God wants to deliver them from it. So then I'm like, okay, this is crazy. First of all, that's crazy. I never really thought. But the definition of of an enslaved person or an oppressed person is that they can't stop working. I was like, oh, right. The
Yeah.
definition of oppression is that they can't stop working, actually. And then when they try, when they raise sort of a voice, then the answer is, I'm going to double your work, right? Like you're
Mm.
going to actually work more. So it's this culture that they're caught in. And I used to think that Moses, gets sidetracked, finally ends up in this desert, and then God calls him. But then I was like, wait a minute. When God calls Moses, what is he doing? He's a shepherd. So I used to think, oh, God's going to call Moses as a deliverer in spite of his long, terrible journey of doubt and giving up and all this stuff. And then I realized, oh, God was just waiting for Moses to become a shepherd because it's part of the identity. And that's the opposite of the empire. He's literally come to the place where now he's back in contact with his land, which actually is back in contact with his identity. And then
Mm.
that's when God is saying, oh, this is what will uproot. Like, this is what will bring a way of deliverance. So when I'm thinking about uprooting the principalities and the powers and the art of winemaking, and we're thinking like, what on earth? I'm like, wait a minute. This is the original story. This is the
Yeah.
original story. You want deliverance? Send a shepherd.
Mm.
Right? You want freedom from this like oppressive, industrialized idea of not only do you see everything as either a commodity or something to take, but
Mm.
then what happens is when you operate in that system, you become also a commodity and something
Right.
that is taken.
Yeah.
And even recently, I shared a quote by Jackie Pullinger, who's one of my heroes in Hong Kong. Somebody said, is your vision of heaven what drives you? And she's hilarious. She said, oh, I'm not driven. She goes, I'm not driven. She said, I'm not even purpose driven. She said, the enemy drives,
Mm.
right? Addiction drives. Like, she said, I'm not driven. She said, I'm spirit led.
Wow.
And I
That's
was like,
beautiful.
what on earth? But she literally in one little answer just said what we're trying to say,
Yeah.
right? Is we're
Totally.
not driven. I'm not even purpose driven. I'm not even redeeming the spirit that drives. I'm
Mm.
led by a shepherd, a good shepherd, by a vineyard. And that's a whole different thing. But that's the kind of thing that actually can make a way out of oppression for so many people.
I've been reading with a group of mine, Walter Brueggemann's The Prophetic Imagination, which is just mind blowing. And one of
Classic,
the things,
everybody should read it,
yes,
especially right now. It's like
yes,
literally, it's a classic. Everybody's got to read that.
yeah. So, one of the things that's been striking me about what he's saying is this need for the prophetic imagination to disrupt and to awaken us to our own death, basically, to sort of the negative, destructive forces that are currently surrounding us and awakening us through lament. But what's fascinating about, as I think about what you just said, is like, I think you're right. I think we're all we're all driven right now, and we're all like slaves to this productivity driven approach, but we just often don't know it. And so part of, I think, what the prophetic imagination is needed for right now is that awakening to the world that we're living in and the system of empire, the system of a productivity driven culture and what it's doing to us. But then also compelling people to a different way of compelling people to what would it look like instead of living in this productivity driven state where we're constantly burning out, where it's always about, what we can do independently, where it's how hard we work to belong, how, like all of those things that keep us stuck in a system of oppression. awakening to that and then painting a different vision that it could be a different way, which I think is what Robin Wall Kimmerer is saying and creating this understory, right? Is helping us to awaken to that there is a different way of living. And I think as I'm connecting with these leaders, I'm leading several leaders through a couple different cohorts right now. There's just this sense of like, oh gosh, I had no idea how much I was living in this way and I want out. And so over the next year, we're just trying to work through like, what does it look like to live from a flourishing approach? And even comparing, at the retreat, for example, we had this exercise where on one side of the table, I had like this jade plant that represents a flourishing approach. And the other side had a microwave, which represents sort of a productivity driven approach, and asking people like, when we view God, do we view God like who views us like a microwave or a jade plant? Do we have a view of God that's shaped by a productivity driven approach that's like God pushes a button and wants to make things happen and expects instant results and is sort of like watching his clock like a manager putting the squeeze on us to produce
That's the
fruit?
deepest uncovering, I think, in this approach is like, I think we can sort of go, oh yeah, I'm caught in these behaviors and schedules and, lack of time and screens and deadlines, and busy is a badge of honor in our culture, which is absolutely ridiculous. But we can see that. But I think the deeper truth is like, we think God's like that. Like the deeper revelation, even in our home group last night, we're doing this Art of Vinemaking for my home group for fun because we can't get enough of Betty. I think for a lot of us, we were just like, yeah, like even when we're in like, I remember at this vineyard cohort, we were at this experience where Dave's like, when the vines are really young, we cut the fruit off immediately because we don't want that vine to expend so much energy that it will weaken itself. We want the vine to send the energy back to the roots and become more resilient for a sustainable future. And I'm like, what?
Hmm.
Like, like even that is just like, what? Like, I think so much of my image of God, and I think this is why Moses's encounter also is this this bush, that is on fire, but the fire's not consuming the bush,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Hmm.
And Moses literally is like, what is this? I don't even know what this is. And God's like, oh, this is holy. And holy literally is like, this is different from
Hmm.
everything else that you've ever known. And it's good. And then God introduces himself to Moses as this God who is not like Pharaoh, who is like literally the opposite. And I just think we have so been like conformed to a pattern that has been so normalized
Hmm.
that we literally need a transformation at our deepest place of who God is. Like, I think it's like one of those moments where it's like the God isn't coming in my life just going like, where's the fruit? Where's the fruit? Where's the productivity? Oh, you're a bad tree. I'm cursing you forever. God is going, ooh, what's going on here? Are you okay?
Right.
Right? Are you
Yeah.
okay? Like, what's going on? Like, what's happening in your life? Like, I need you to flourish. I want you to be
Hmm.
healthy. I want you to be whole.
Hmm.
When I'm not producing fruit, and this was another thing with Dave. Dave isn't coming going, oh, bad vine, cut it out.
That's right.
Cut that thing
Yeah.
out. Get that thing out. That thing's fruitless. He's going, what have I done? What's
Mm-hmm.
happening? What does this vine need?
Hmm.
This vine was created to be fruitful. So what's the problem here? Not like blaming and I just even that, like the fact that like if I don't do it right, if I don't succeed, if I don't have all these fruits, God's coming in and he's going to cut me down. Like
Right. Yeah.
he's going to be so disappointed. And just to meet a vineyard guy that says, no, that I'm not disappointed in the vine.
Yeah. That's right.
Something's wrong. I got to figure out what's wrong and make this a flourishing environment. I mean, what
I know.
kind of image do we have of God?
Yeah. Well, and the fascinating thing, so when he was telling me about how he does pruning, he says that he has a system at the end, of the winter when the vines are starting to wake up and he's deciding what to prune or cut away. He ranks them 1, 2, and 3. One is, the canes have grown all the way up to the trellis and it's healthy enough. So he'll prune that back the least. Now, he will still take 90% the branches, which was also mind blowing. But then if it's ranked 2, it's grown only halfway up and he'll remove half of the fruit of the vine. So one half of the vine, when the fruit starts to come, he'll take it off. And then a vine that's ranked 3 has really been struggling and perhaps has winter damage, and he will take all of the fruit off that year so that it can focus on growing and healing and growing a root system to sustain things. And like you said, with vines that are under 3 years of age that will intentionally take the fruit off. And he said, there was a vineyard owner who, under sort of this productivity driven industrialized approach, tried to hang fruit on a vine that was under 3 years of age, and it crashed the vine. And they
Mhm.
could barely get it to grow the next year. And Dave just kept telling me, like, I'm not mad at this vine when I have to take the fruit off.
Right.
I'm intentionally saying, like, what can I do to do everything in my power to help you thrive, to help you flourish for the long haul? And that it's okay with him if there's a season where the vine isn't yielding fruit. And that was the thing, too. I think, one of the things, even as we engaged with the retreat participants a couple weeks ago, of realizing that everything has a season and that fruit is only like harvest is just a couple weeks, right? It's not. I think we constantly live like it's always harvest season. Like we've always got something, have to have something to show for our work, for our efforts.
Well, and
And
that's industrialized
yeah,
concept. That's a mindset of like, we will plant several crops in this season to get as much as we can. Then, of course, it's unsustainable because the land just it doesn't get all the things it needs to replenish itself. So it's unsustainable. So, but it's just like take everything we can as fast as we possibly can. And then let's do it again, another
right.
place. Let's do it again,
Yeah,
another place. Let's do it again, another place. And you're just like, guys, this is literally the ministry model.
right. Yes.
But then you're
Yes.
just leaving behind you like workers. Like, I mean, you and I both know the
Mm,
carnage in my
hmm.
lifetime of other workers who love Jesus, who started with these beautiful dreams and visions, who are just broken, many of whom who've lost their faith, who were doing such beautiful work. But again, I think this productivity, this outcome based, like you must produce, just created such unhealth in them. And, when I was talking to Dave too, in this thing that we were at, I was very captivated by this energy idea.
Hmm.
Like Dave's like, it takes so much, it takes 90% of the vine's energy to like ripen the fruit.
Hmm.
So that vine cannot ripen that fruit without either dying if it's not well enough, that ripening process will be the end of the vine. And so a lot of that is just about energy. It's about like actually, and even when they remove the harvest happens quickly, it's gone. They don't do they just let it lay. They just like let everything be because he said that takes a while for the energy that these vines have been sending upward
Hmm.
to actually come back down. And he said, I want all that energy to be in the roots of that vine before I come along and do anything.
Hmm.
And
Hmm.
I just think to myself, like, does anybody in ministry ever let things lie
Well,
so
and
that
that's the
the
thing that,
energy
yeah,
they've been extending outward could actually find its way
right.
inward and downward into a deepening of our flourishing? And that's the thing. It's like I don't think so. I mean, not people that I know, not people that I know.
Yeah. Well, and it's all rhythms, right? It's the cyclical rhythm of the vine. The thing that's what I've been learning the most about, which, as he said in that moment, right now, this is what's happening in the vines here in Traverse City is all the grapes are being taken away to the winery. And what happens is the leaves then channel the remaining energy they're soaking up from the sun into the roots. And that's what gets stored over dormancy. And he said, if you're taking grapes, you're taking the most important part of the plant. And you have to be thinking about what are you doing to invest back into the vine through composting, through cover cropping, and putting nutrients back into the soil, which I just think is such a beautiful approach to how God tends us. And I know for me right now, after sort of launching the book and all these things, like God's been speaking to me this morning about, hey, Betty, like it's time to nourish that soil. Like let's
Mhm.
tend to your roots. Let's go sink back down. And then that begins this cyclical rhythm that really mirrors Jesus's death, resurrection, and life, where the shift is from the fruit to the roots. And I just think that's the journey that Jesus wants to lead us on. And that's the journey, that's the plot that unfolds throughout the whole Christian story, right? Is that we're supposed to abide in Jesus, in his life, death, and resurrection. And I think we have a really easy time saying, oh, I'm going to abide in Jesus in the life, in the harvest, like it's always harvest. We have a harder time saying, okay, like after the harvest, I'm going to now descend into my roots, descend into the soil, descend with Jesus into the grave, into letting go, into surrender, into trust that I'm not just the fruit I produce, that when the fruit is taken away, it's this detachment. It's the spiritual practice of detachment of saying, I'm not the fruit I produce, but
Mhm.
I'm connected to the vine, and that's the most important thing about me. And that I can tend to my belovedness in Jesus and can be nourished by the soil of this, what the Spirit is doing in times of rest and dormancy. And there's lots of other things that happen in that season too, like lament and, tending to what's been going on this, all the things that have been busy preoccupying us in the harvest months, slowing down to attend to the inner life of what Jesus wants to do within the soil of our souls. That takes time. I mean, dormancy is half the year here in Traverse City. And so that's not something we can rush through. And if vines don't take times of dormancy or rest, there will not be a harvest. There will not
Or
be fruit.
the land as well.
Yes,
And I wonder, I
absolutely.
guess that's part of I think, like, even the word dormancy makes it sound like nothing's happening. And that's, I think, one of the awakening, as I read this book and started to understand these seasons just a little bit, more. I'm gonna keep learning more. But, like, dormancy, it just looks like nothing's happening.
Mhm,
Right? Like, it's this, like, we're not attending to the external, like the fruit or the harvest or the buds, but actually much of the important, sustaining, deepest work, it's just unseen, right? It's happening in the depths, in the soil, in
mhm,
the roots, in the
mhm,
so that's part of, I think, for me, also, it was an awakening to, like, what does every season hold? Because I think because we're not used to thinking seasonally, because we're not, we're just like, it's always harvest time, baby. Show me the fruit, like, show me the money, and it's like, no, actually, if we do, and again, Dave is really good about this because he's this expert in biodiversity and in organic farming, and he will go and try to help farmers just begin to move in that direction. And so one of the things he said on that retreat, Betty, was, if they can change one or two things, in 1 year, we're winning, right? Which I thought was really also just a seasoned, wise way of also thinking about change. Because often, too, when we think about change, we're like, it's all or nothing, right? We got to change the whole thing. Like everything has to be. But actually, it's this incremental moves
mhm,
toward a flourishing life. And one of those, I think, for me is saying, like, these seasons that we're in our lives, they all hold something beautiful so that they all have a promise. So this idea of letting things lie, of just like trusting and then letting God maybe and letting ourselves even go a little deeper, rooted in establishing God's love. Are we? Like those seasons are really good to say, like, if you're not producing fruit, the people are going, look at you, you're so amazing. Are you rooted in God's love?
mm.
If your identity is externally based, then you're probably not rooted in God's love. So then maybe this is the time to actually bring all that stuff and fortify your root system of where you're rooted, even.
And that we need that every year, right? Like every year a vine goes through a season of dormancy. And I know, these seasons aren't necessarily the same for all of us every time through the cycle, but we all need to follow the cycle of life, death, and resurrection of tending, from harvest down into our roots. And that every time through we learn something new. Like you said, it's not all at once. And I think that's the beauty of God's patience with us. I mean, there's been times where it feels like I go through the same cycle every year, or like something gets pricked in my heart, or like I have a wound that just keeps reopening. And I'm like, what the heck? Like, did I not learn this the last time went through this painful experience? And I think it's not God's punishment of us, but God's love to say, gosh, there's still more there that needs to be healed. And one time through isn't going to do it. So, like, here we go again. Let me remind you of who you are and let me heal that part. And the next time through, it'll be a little bit deeper, the healing. And that's not, there's nothing wrong with the vine, that every season is important. And we did this exercise for those listeners who weren't obviously there. We did this exercise at the end of the retreat where we had them walk through sort of these seasons of the vine of the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus. And, the death of Jesus is really a posture of surrender. And these are the postures of infinitum too, that we've talked about, of surrender, generosity, and other-centered mission, where we talked about, seasons of post-harvest, dormancy, pruning, our seasons of Christ's death, where we're surrendering, we're letting go. We're allowing God to tend to our roots. And then you have seasons of resurrection in your life too, where there's bud break, there's growing, there's creativity, there's collaboration and community, there's flowering, those seasons of life that spurs forth in us that, we learn to become beloved and belong in a community. And then there's seasons of Christ's life, which are, where the fruit ripens, where we have this outward expression, where the fruit is yielded for the sake of others. And what I loved about that exercise is we had people place themselves like, what season am I in right now? And there
Mm.
was a celebration of each season as holy. Like there wasn't, oh, this one season's bad, or, pruning, ooh, like I don't want to be in that season, or that's bad, I shouldn't be there. It was a no, each is important, each is essential, and we all find ourselves in one of these seasons at one point or another. And that if you're not, actually something's probably wrong. And so I think that that's an invitation that I'd long for all people to have, is this surrendering to the path, surrendering to the rhythm, and to not beat ourselves down because we don't have fruit right now. And obviously,
Mm.
the fruit looks different. The way Jesus sees fruit is a lot different than I think our culture sees fruit. But yeah, letting go and surrendering to each.
That's beautiful. How can people journey with you on this? Where should they go?
Yeah, I think if somebody wanted to just dive in, I think if you go to the Art of Vinemaking, there's lots of different touch points that people can go through this. So there's obviously the book, which would be a good starting place. But I really long for people to journey through this together. So, as I shared earlier, we're formed on the right side of our brain, which is our relational connections and embodied experiences. And so that's why we formed these online cohorts, or these journeys that take these in person retreats and then an online cohort. And all of the online course materials through the Deep and Wide Academy, by the way, are intentionally created to lead you into embodied spiritual practices. So there's audio guided walks, there's imaginative prayer exercises, things that kind of help get you into your body and into your imagination to envision a different way, but then journey together with a group. And I would say too, we have the Sonoma journey that's launching in May, where we'll have an in-person retreat in Sonoma, and then it'll start this year-long cohort going through the online courses. But some people may want to go through this with a small group, and you could do a cohort with a small group or with your church community. And we would also love to work with you to kind of create a custom journey for your people. And maybe even there's vineyards near you where you want to have an embodied experience in the vineyard. And that's the thing, that's the dream we're exploring, is to be able to launch these journeys in different vineyards around the world so that we can all have an embodied encounter with them and learn to retend to our souls and reconnect with the land as we journey together.
So that's a lot of touch points, people. So, like, the book is obviously a great place to begin. A cohort, the course, there's
Hmm.
a course up on Deep Wide Academy. And then Sonoma is going to be an immersion, right? Like, so like a full, you're in the vineyard, you're doing one of these things that I was just at, which I highly recommend. And one of the things I think, if you can just come to experience it, but also, like Betty said, if you're someone that wants to help people discover this, that's a great thing to go to, because that would be a really beautiful way of experiencing for yourself. Oh, this is how that works.
Hmm.
And this is why this is, so mind blowing and life changing. So highly recommend it. And you can follow Betty in your writings, Betty on Substack,
Hmm.
right?
Hmm. Yep.
BettyDickinson.substack.com. So
It's something like that. The
something like that.
publication's called Awakening the Soul.
Awakening the Soul. Okay. But probably if you put in Substack and Betty Dickinson, you would get there.
Yes, totally.
But I don't know, who knows? Anyway, this has been beautiful, really beautiful in my own life. Thanks for inviting me to that retreat, and it was an absolute joy to be part of it and to learn from it, and kind of to just also see, for those of you, who are thinking, how do I do this? The art of vine making is one of the ways. Infinitum is one of the ways, where I just really have been trying for many years now to just practice being surrendered and practice being generous and open to receive, and then also to freely give, and then practice, getting myself out of the center of every story and trying to serve others. And that itself, sometimes I just feel ridiculous because it seems so simple.
Mm.
People are just like, how do you, and again, when we talk about abiding, like, how do we abide? And we all feel like we should be a monk somewhere in a monastery, just like, doing 2 hours a day in silent meditation. And sure, explore, do what you got to do. But I just feel like actually sometimes we just make it too hard. And I think that's one of the things. I think also, Dave, and your journey, Betty, with Dave, discovering that actually it's God's desire that you would flourish. Like, God is the vine dresser. God is the one who says, "Come on. I want to do what will help you flourish." So sometimes it's also just going, "Oh, yeah, like, this is part of the design." Like, it's actually
Mhm.
we're out of the design, and this is
Mhm.
actually relaxing into this is the way it was always meant to be, God working for my and with me for my flourishing. Relax. Relax, you're invited, and it's good news. And I do think it already has. A shepherd has already overthrown an empire. And then the good shepherd has forever overthrown the demonic principalities and powers. And then the question just becomes, how do we model that? How do we reveal that? How do we show the deeper truth? How do we say to the enemy, I know something you don't know? It's about organic farming. We're all gonna flourish, buddy, but with a good God. Thank you, Betty,
Mm.
for showing us that, for teaching us that, for modeling that, and, for inviting people to join you.
Thanks for having me along.